Welcome to the Wade Center's podcast.
A podcast of Wheaton College. He was a very stay-at-home type person. Even Lewis got wounded and said, I'm in Bristol, I'm in the hospital, I've got these shrapnel wounds, please come see me. And he just loved routine. And Lewis reports, I think it's in Surprised by Joy, they would go to the beach, this beautiful, North Shore of Ireland, and see Dunluce Castle. And his father would walk up and down the sand in a suit looking at his watch. So I think that part of what killed his career is to be a politician, you have to travel and glad hand. He was he loved his routine.
Welcome to the Wade Center podcast. And now that we are allowed to have researchers come and study our holdings by appointment, we have another wonderful Wade scholar.
Kilby Award winner.
Yes, who is with us to discuss her work. And her name, it's a beautiful name. Her name is Crystal Hurd. And we joke about the fact that because we're two of the only Crystals in C.S. Lewis and Inkling studies, we sometimes get emails intended for the other person. But we have an intention to pick Crystal's brain about her work on C.S. Lewis. She has both an Ed.D. and a Ph.D. from East Tennessee State University, as well as a Master of Fine Arts in Creative Writing. So she understands both the critical aspect of Lewis as well as the creative aspect. And her creative writing degree is from University of Texas at El Paso. And her doctoral research focused on C.S. Lewis as a transformational leader. She currently serves as a visiting professor for Northwind Seminary's Doctorate in Theology and Ministry for Inkling Studies and Romantic Theology. So we have lots to talk about with you, Crystal. And when I first encountered you, you were presenting papers on C.S. Lewis's family of origin. And I know that this is something you have studied at the Wade and are really interested in pursuing. Why don't you tell us how you got interested in Lewis's family of origin, his mother and father?
Alrighty. Well, thank you guys for having me here. This is such a joy.
I'm
totally
here
intended.
as well. This is David. let me go on record as saying I object to pick your brain.
Oh, okay.
It sounds to me like someone said their skull removed and vultures are picking at their brain tissue.
We will.
So I would rather say... We'd rather solicit your ideas about X or Y. So.
Well, I am a migraine sufferer, so I
is that right?
Okay.
Okay.
It can apply
okay.
on multiple levels.
Let us drill holes in your brain over the topic of C.S. Lewis.
So, as you mentioned, in 2012, I completed a doctorate in educational leadership and policy analysis, and I decided to do C.S. Lewis as transformational leader, which is one of the leadership theories. And so I went through his whole corpus of work and pulled out a lot of great stuff. And I'm working on the book. The book will be available in the fall through Wingline Press on Lewis as leader. When I came to the Wade, I intended to do some fundamental research on Albert's influence.
His father.
Yes, on Lewis as an individual. And then later on as a spiritual mentor. And there's a whole lot of negative press on Albert, as you all well know, in a lot of the biographies.
He does get a bad rap.
Lewis even mentions when he was writing Surprised by Joy, he omitted some of the stuff he wrote about Albert.
Because it was just so disturbing.
Yeah, he said he didn't want to commit the sin of Ham, right? He wanted to cover up some of his...
What he left in is pretty strong.
Yeah, absolutely.
He makes him look like kind of a Dickensian eccentric.
Yeah, and that which is a very fitting way to look at it because both men were lovers of Dickens' work and Trollope. And Lewis and Lewis's extended family were very much part of the church ecclesiastical environment because, Flora's father was a reverend, an Anglican reverend who was very outspoken against Catholics. Flora's
father. So Flora is Lewis's mother.
Yes.
We need to explain these things for our listeners.
I want to jump in again. When you bring up Flora, Lewis says, my mother's family were a cooler race, kind of relaxed and knowing how to get but that doesn't seem to fit Flora's own father. I wonder if he tended to idealize his lost mother and tended to be unduly critical of his living father. Do you think that the idea that they were a cooler race, they knew the best place to go and train, is that him developing an attitude toward the two parents, depending upon. Normally, if your mom lives long enough, you'll develop some criticisms of your mom. But she died
Yeah.
when he was 9 years old.
Yeah.
And it's easy to idealize not only her, but also that whole half of the family. Did you
Yeah.
find some of that in your research?
Yeah, the Hamiltons were actually very emotive that I found.
Right. Yeah.
I mean, supposedly, I was just reading the other day where they said that Thomas would weep in the middle of his sermons, and they
So this
said-
is Lewis's grandfather.
yes, this is Lewis's grandfather who was at St. Mark's Parish.
I'm different. I tend to weep while listening to other people's sermons. So that's a little different when the pastor himself weeps. Yeah.
Yeah, it's funny because it said on the pew that all the Hamiltons would lean over and say he's doing a weepy one today. But yeah, he was incredibly. And her mother, Mary Hamilton, was an incredibly politically outspoken member of the church. She was actually against Albert and home rule, and actually at one point sent him some pamphlets for him to reconsider his position.
Oh, wow.
I hate to keep jumping in with background, but home rule was the idea that Ireland should have its own autonomous state.
Yeah.
But in Northern Ireland, it's dominated by Protestants, and they don't want home rule. Their adage was home rule is Rome rule. They thought their whole province of the north would be ruled by the Catholic in the south from the Republic of Ireland. So he was very anti-home rule, Albert was, where she was more ecumenical, I think.
Yeah, she was very outspoken. And because the Hamiltons were a traditionally aristocratic family, she had the privilege to speak out and not be punished or, blacklisted for her outspoken opinions. But she remained very outspoken for most of the childhood. There's this great scene where, and it's in the Lewis papers, but I think it's recalled in other places too, where Warney talks about going into the house and it smells of cats everywhere, that Mary's hand extends and there's all these rings, but you can also tell that she's a poultry farmer. And that when you finally arrive at dinner time, everyone rushes the room and they leave the guest with the chair with 3 solid legs instead of 4, and you eat your salmon off of chipped porcelain dishes.
It sounds like Miss Havisham and speaking of Dickens.
It does.
Like
It does. It's sort
great
of
expectations.
like this idea of the old aristocracy, right? And sort of just leaning against that. And that was sort of what they had. And of course, Lewis, if you look back into his lineage, he comes directly from Robert the Bruce of Scotland and James II.
No.
Yes.
I didn't know that.
James II. And that's all on
Now,
the Hamilton
You
side.
can't just make the stuff up for these interviews. you do have, because I knew that they went back to Norman Knights in Battle Abbey, he says in Surprised by Joy. But how would he get some Robert the Bruce in there? And 'cause I thought he was mainly Welsh and English on that side.
He is mainly Welsh on the Lewis side specifically. It's all Welsh farmers.
Right.
Yeah, all back on Richard's side. Richard was his grandfather, Albert's father. They were all, Boilermakers, engineers. And then on Flora's side, they were ministers, lawyers, and just aristocrats.
Yeah, well, if you go to Wales even today, you see a lot of Lewis hardware. You see Williams and you see Lewis and 3 or 4 other names that are still very prominent in Wales.
Really?
Yeah.
So he's related through his mother's side to those people?
Yeah, he's
Interesting.
technically Scottish royalty.
Aw.
Yeah.
I'm so glad that he had many gifts, but ruling a country was not one of them.
Well,
He
if
would-
you've
he
read
would fall
equality, he says none of us are,
Yeah, that's right,
are
that's
qualified
right.
to rule a hen roost, right? So,
Doesn't
he
he
could
make
barely
several,
stay awake during a committee meeting, so he didn't do well being
doesn't
in
he make
court.
several jokes about if he were in charge or something like that?
Yeah, he does make those, but we're all glad he wasn't in
Exactly.
charge.
right.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
in
Right.
1941, right, he was vice president at the college for a bit and just hated it. He was like, I'm getting used to having to dictate letters and you make phone calls and push papers around. It was so boring.
Yeah, that's part of the reason I love Lewis. I'm the same way. Sometimes they would ask him to take minutes on a meeting, and he would do it in rhyming couplets in Chaucerian English, like he was writing a Mallory or something of that sort. And you got to love somebody who takes committee minutes in Renaissance English.
That is interesting in light of the fact that you're doing research on Lewis's leadership, since he disliked being in positions of leadership. So how does that work?
So leadership, when I first started my degree program, I had a very traditional perspective of leadership, sort of the CEO, the manager, the pastor, what have you. And one of the things that we talked about, and it was sort of our foundational class on leadership, was that there are different types of power, and that individuals who are charismatic and honest and compassionate have this draw that people come to them. So we talked about, people like Gandhi and Jesus and Martin Luther King Jr., who were not, quote unquote, what the French was one of the early leadership theorists, would call legitimate power. Legitimate power is, I'm the boss, here's my corner office, type thing. Referent power means that people are just drawn to you because you're a good person and you have things to say that are resonant with people. So when I started looking into that, I was like, wow, C.S. Lewis, a lot of these qualities, And then when you consider, and I actually quoted some of David's work in my dissertation, especially when you're talking about being 15 and you told your dad you wanted to be a good person or be a good Christian.
Oh, yeah. Well, I think, my dad actually had the qualities you're talking about. He was an organizational leader, but he also was a very inspirational leader. I was about 15, and I was talking about our little local church in Colorado Springs. And I said, these people are so uptight and legalistic and joyless. I mean, who wants to become a Christian if this is what you're talking about? And my dad said, well, David, you've done the easy part. And I said, what do you mean? Well, you've identified that so many Christians are very poor ambassadors for the kingdom. Now I want you to think about how to be a better ambassador for the kingdom. And literally several decades later, I'm still remembering those words. It's so easy to critique how other people didn't do it right.
Yeah.
But how do you actually become yourself the embodiment of the fragrance of Christ to those that are perishing? Yeah, that was a formative moment for me. My dad, I love my dad because he was both an organizational leader for the Navigators, but he was also that kind of person who would say something that you would stop and think, and you still are thinking about it, several decades later.
Oh yeah, and I think, and I think especially Lewis's later work was really was evidence of, if you think about the BBC radio talks,
right,
and all of the RAF talks he gave, and later on the sermons like The Weight of Glory. There were so many times where, because he was honest and full of wisdom, he was asked to share that wisdom. And then here we are in 2021 still talking about the ideas that he had. One of the things that really resonates with me is that I read Mere Christianity. That was my first introduction to Lewis. It was actually not
It's a good place
Narnia.
to start.
Yeah.
Good place to start.
And for I was sort of experiencing the same thing you were. I came out of a 4-year English literature degree at the University of Tennessee, which is a secular university, and I wanted the same level of engagement and that same intellectual rigor, but I wanted it with all the spiritual underpinnings.
Yeah.
And we have that. If we look at all the great stuff like Milton and Dante, we have all this stuff that has, that's simmering with all this spiritual context. Where did it go? Right. So I remember thinking, where are these people? Where are they hiding? Surely it's not all just sermon books and things like that, which was kind of what I grew up with. So someone just mentioned in an offhand comment to me, you should read Mere Christianity. So I went and bought it at the bookstore, and I think I was like 3 or 4 pages in. I was highlighting whole pages, writing in the margin. I'm one of those terrible people that completely miss, puts margin notes in and highlights. And
just make sure it's not a library note.
Yeah. I paid for that one, so
underline everything.
Yeah, I paid for it, so I can do whatever I want.
I had the same experience. I had a feeling they're like good people and smart people, but they were different categories. And when I started reading Lewis, I said, here's a really smart person who's also a really good person. He has a lot of spiritual depth.
Yeah,
I had that same experience reading Mere Christianity.
And so with transformational leadership theory, which was my guiding theoretical framework, intellect is one of the characteristics of a transformational leader. And I was saying, he hits all these boxes here. And because he's not what we consider a conventional leader, a lot of people poo-poo the idea. And I've had people tell me, I don't really think, he just wrote children's books, right? And I'm like, how long do you have? Sit down and let me educate you. Do you have a Snickers available? Because he write children's books. You don't casually say that around me.
Yeah.
I'm not
right,
expecting
right,
a 30-minute talk
Yeah.
about everything.
Children's books, which have sold over 100 million
Oh,
copies,
yeah.
so he's
Yeah.
doing something right there. Right.
I mean, Lewis is one of the few spiritual mentors, I think, too, that will follow you all the way through your journey.
right.
You can
Right.
start in Narnia,
Yeah.
and then from a fictional standpoint, I think his books are phenomenal. So he is so underrated as an adult fiction writer.
Right.
Mm.
I
Oh,
agree.
yeah.
So
I
underrated.
agree.
Oh yeah.
Yeah,
Mm.
but one of the things we were talking about the family. One of the things that I've seen as I've done all the research is that he came from a crop of poets and writers.
Mhm.
I mean, just yesterday I found where Richard, his dad's dad, had written a children's story
Hmm.
for his children. Just wrote
Really?
it for his children. Yeah, Timothy Tumbledown.
Timothy Tumbledown.
Have
So-
you
and-
read the story?
It's a fragment. It's only
Oh,
chapter
okay.
2.
Aw.
Leave me hanging there, but
Well, Flora wrote a story that got published, right? Have you?
yes, the
yeah.
Princess
Really?
Rosetta. Yes,
Right.
yeah, which is lost. We cannot find it. We've looked
Oh,
everywhere
no.
for it.
Oh.
Yeah, and there is a mention of a second story that she wrote, and she basically says in a letter, I'm just too lazy to do this
Uh-huh.
with more. I'd try harder, but I'm just
Yeah.
I'm just too lazy. It's so funny because Flora was a mathematician, right?
Right.
And her,
Super unusual for her time.
oh my goodness,
To get a degree in math.
oh my goodness.
Yeah.
If you go back into the history of Queens, she was a pioneer. That's a quote from one of the books on Queens College.
Really?
They talked about how she.
This is the one in Belfast.
Yes,
Right.
yes. She was one of the few women, especially in math and logic. And as far as Victorian women, she was doing okay in music theory, okay in French, but here she is just killing it in algebra and logic.
Which is ironic because one of Lewis's weak suits was mathematics.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so
Well-
was Albert. Albert was terrible at it too.
Yeah. Well, Walter said he had trouble splitting a bill. They'd have lunch together.
Oh really? His
And
brother?
Lewis would kind of go, well, you had that and I had this. So who owes what? It's so
Yeah.
ironic that his mother had a master's in advanced in mathematics and he
Yeah.
couldn't figure out how to
Oh, yeah.
split up.
Although he was
Lewis
really good
bill.
at logic, and he did.
Yeah, he was good
at
did,
logic.
He did focus a lot on like propositional logic,
Right,
formal.
right.
symbols
He's
and
sort
things
of
like
a perfect storm of genetic
Uh-huh.
talents.
that.
Because he has the sort of compassion and argumentation that made him so great at the Oxford Socratic Club, which was Albert's contribution. And then the logic that makes him such a great apologist, I feel, is from Flora's side.
Oh, that's a good point. Well, Albert, I think I read something by you, or else we talked about it, that Albert was quite well respected as a solicitor and as a speaker.
Really?
Oh, yeah.
So his image of him is something of a buffoon in Surprised by Joy. This is the more forgiving older Lewis. When they were in their 20s, they talked about
They
the
who?
OAB. He and his brother, they talked
Oh.
about Albert as the potato head or
Yeah.
the
The
OAB.
OAB.
Yeah, the old air
airbag.
balloon.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I thought it was very interesting. Well, I think in general, children are not very magnanimous toward their parents.
Mhm.
But some of your research uncovered the fact that Albert was quite respected in his own right, regardless of just being the father of a famous writer.
Wow.
Oh, absolutely.
Did-
Absolutely. And
Did
I feel
his grandfather, the preacher, have any impact on him? That's one of the things I've always been interested in. I mean, I know he went away to school, and his mother died when he was young. But did he have much of an impact on him?
Thomas Hamilton was, well, forgive me, but he was kind of a prude.
Oh, okay.
Oh.
He was like one of those people who are constantly like judging you and sort of preaching at you about everything.
Okay, all right.
And he was
And
kind of parochial, right? He was very pro-Protestant, and
yeah,
Catholics
Gotcha.
have nothing to
Yeah.
bring to
I mean,
the table.
he served as a chaplain in the Navy for a while, and supposedly there's a story that was in the papers where one of the people on the ship cussed in front of him, and so he asks, very adroitly, he asked the man, if you were in front of the enemy right now, what would you do? And the sailor responded, my duty. And he goes, well, sir, I am faced with my enemy, and I am doing my duty by calling out his bad language.
Oh.
Wow.
I'm
Called
doing
the
my
guy
duty.
the enemy. He was a little bit prickly on
Yikes.
some of that stuff.
Yeah, it sounds like
And then later years, he's a smart guy, But in later years, they say he just sort of migrated to his library and hung out in there.
Interesting.
That brings interesting valence to a story that Douglas Gresham, C.S. Lewis's stepson, told us several years ago, that one time when Lewis got mad, he heard his stepfather yell, "Curse word, curse word, curse word." He didn't want to use vulgar language, so he may have inherited that reservation from his grandfather.
Well, and it reminds me of when we talked about Pilgrim's Regress at the beginning of the book, how staunch and conservative the religion he depicts in the beginning of the book
Right.
is.
It's very forbidding.
Yeah.
How about expletive?
lots of rules.
It's very interesting because Reverend Hamilton will say no pleasure, no temptation, things like that. And then when we read, because it's interesting, Richard Lewis, which was Albert's father, was in a workman's literary society that he started with several guys, and so they would read papers, they would talk about spiritual matters, and so some of those essays are included in the Lewis papers. And so he talks about he's talking about Nineveh in the one I was working with today. But it's interesting because he actually argues that no, and it reminded me of the introduction that he wrote for Smoke on the Mountain, right? Where he talks about,
Joy Davidson's
with
book.
Joy Davidson's book. Richard Lewis says, yes, you can have some pleasure, just learn how to be discerning and, things like that, which is the kind of the same thing he's arguing in Smoke on the Mountain, right? We can't have total and absolute
denial.
Of pleasures of the self. We just have to learn to balance those things instead. Because I think, again, he saw probably his grandfather Hamilton, who was very staunch, and ran a really tight household, and was, according to the papers, he was one of those guys who was always talking about God. Not in a bad way, but you'd be standing at the grocery store and they're like, "Hey, have you thought about Jesus today?" While you're buying a Snickers bar, and then
really
uses it as a
he's really good at the Jesus jukes. That's what we call it.
Yes, exactly.
It's where you can turn any conversation back into
Jesus juke king right there. Absolutely.
Now, one of the things you keep mentioning, Crystal, and I think our listeners may need an explanation.
I thought you were Crystal.
Is the Lewis papers. Why don't you explain what those are?
Oh, sure. So, Warnie Lewis actually collected a lot of the family papers.
And he, of course, is Lewis's brother.
From Little Lee. Right before they sold it, they had pulled out
that was their house in Belfast.
Yes. Thank you.
Belfast is in Ireland.
Yes.
We'll have a glossary at the end of the episode for those of you missing.
Ireland is an island to the west of England.
Mea culpa.
Yeah.
Yeah. So Little Lee, right, was the house that Albert had built for the family, which Lewis mentions in the book was he was probably completely ripped off when they built. And Albert really was bad.
Why ripped off?
He was charged a lot of extra for, and then of course the drafty rooms, which Lewis was enchanted by as a kid, probably would be like, what? Who built this? Like, where's the blueprint?
Jerry Root tells the story that he read about the house in Surprised by Joy, and the contractors obviously took advantage of Albert, and it wasn't a great house and had all these problems. And he said when he visited it in Belfast, in Strandtown, the suburb, he said it was beautiful and it was beautifully made. And he thought that Jerry Root, may his name be blessed, felt that part of Lewis's negative attitude towards his father got transferred to the house. He said, actually, anybody would love that house and think it was beautifully built. Since it was his father who sponsored it or paid for it, Lewis kind of had this attitude of, it wasn't that great. It had all these problems and had bad
It
drainage.
has a lot of, quote unquote baggage with it because, as you remember, when Flora had her surgery, they did it on the dining room table.
Right.
At Little Lee.
During dinner, which was really inappropriate.
David.
No, I'm sorry.
It's a beautiful house. If you've ever been to Belfast, I have. I've had to watch from behind the fence, of course. Sandy Smith. Sandy Smith is a C.S. Lewis scholar from Belfast, and he works for the council there, the tourism council. So he takes you to the house. You can't go, past it. But Albert he wanted a really nice home. He was. As we mentioned earlier, he was very well respected in Belfast. There are cartoons of him that appeared in the papers.
Really?
There were people wrote poems about him, about how he was incredibly persuasive.
Really?
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
And he had a fabulous memory for literary quotations, which is just like our man, Clive.
Right. Oh, yeah.
Right.
I mean, it's obvious when you start reading into the papers, all this stuff, which, sorry, I got sidetracked.
Yeah.
So the Lewis papers were collected after Albert's death. And then in 1933.
But what are they? They were collected after his death, but explain them.
So they're basically family correspondent, and they all the way back to... which Warren kind of serves as our narrator for this, which is kind of nice, and he refers to himself in the third person, and then which is neat. But he provides historical background, and then actually lists some of the things he used to provide those historical backgrounds. He introduces a lot of his family members like characters in a book, and then he provides letters, diary entries, sermons.
Yeah.
Political speeches. We have a ton of political speeches by the young Albert, the young conservative Albert.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And so a lot of but of course, later on it becomes mainly letters and Warney's diary, which takes up a greater part of the latter part of the papers. But it's really interesting because it is a chronology, really, of the lives of these people.
It's like 11 volumes or 13 volumes or
11 volumes, and they're all about 360 pages, something like that.
Tell us about your introduction to the Lewis papers. We were talking before we turned on the podcast microphone. You were talking about how you first got introduced to the Lewis papers.
Yeah, so in 2013, I came here for one day. I had one day, which is, like, wow, like, what are you going to do in one day? It's like, it was crazy. So at the time, I was preparing for, to do some foundational leadership stuff, postdoc on it. And so I looked up a few things, and I had planned, and I came back in 2014 to do additional research on the family, partly because I provided a chapter in the Women in Lewis book, which I think you guys are also into, on Flora. So I needed some more information on Flora Lewis, and she was an incredibly brilliant human being. I mean, just incredibly brilliant. And it's unfortunate that she is defined by her death and not by her life. She contributed so much in those 9 years to Jack's formative.
She died in her 40s, which ironically was about the same age that Joy Davidman died.
Right.
Really?
Yeah, there's this strange kind of repetition in some of the tragedies of his life.
It's interesting because he's so down on his father, but I have to think that when Joy died and left him with 2 boys to raise, that he didn't feel some kind of empathy. With Albert. Finally, this is what my dad felt like every day of his life. Right. To have these reminders, of this love, and to be, and there's even an entry in the Lewis papers, and we'll get back to that. But there's an entry where at one point Albert says, because Flora died on his birthday.
Oh, really? I didn't know that.
Yeah, and he says, I'm X years today, but I'm 17 years alone. So that date is always has a shadow.
Every year his birthday rolls around, he has to remember that.
And his brother had just died in the same summer, so
and his father.
Summer.
His father. It was like triple grief that he was having.
And Lewis always felt bad later that he didn't empathize more.
Oh, absolutely.
He said, when I see these traits in other old men, I consider them to be kind of amusing eccentricities. But when I saw them in my father, I was very judgmental. So I think one of his greatest regrets in life is that he didn't express more sympathy and empathy for his father at that time of their life.
He said it in multiple places too throughout the letters that he was just horrid to his father, and he tries to be nice to other old men to compensate. But speaking of Albert, when I came to the Wade in 2013, I had that one day, so I looked at the love sonnets, because who wouldn't want to look at the love sonnets?
Explain them.
So those are Joy Davidman's sonnets that she wrote for Lewis. We don't know 100% if he knew about them or not, but Don King actually published them in The Naked Tree, which you can purchase now. But they're interesting, and it's a very different way of looking at Lewis through a lens of the love poems. But hey, she loved him. So I looked at the love poems, and then I had some time. So one of the librarians there suggested that I pluck one of the Lewis paper volumes off the shelf. So I just indiscriminately pulled one off the shelf, opened it up, and started flipping through. And I found this letter from Albert to Warren. And he basically says, and this has been noted a lot, that Albert was incredibly generous with both of his sons. Very generous with both his sons. So he says, I think this letter is 1919 or something like that. And he says, well, I'm going to send you the underwear you requested. And he was like, since when did you get interested in effeminate and old man clothes? And I remember like cackling in the library and being like, who is this guy? Like, this is not the man that, shut all the windows and ate his hot meal at 2:30. And, here's the irritant, right? From Surprised by Joy. But he was so funny. And his humor. And so that sort of set me on a path to start learning more about Albert and Flora and sort of understanding. And I work at my day job is as a teacher. I teach dual enrollment at a high school. And one of the things that we talk a lot about is educational psychology, right? What are the traits and the circumstances that create the student that comes into your room? Like what sort of accumulation of events and circumstances, have occurred to them, because you have to teach to that to be effective. So I just applied that same curiosity to Lewis. So how do you make a Lewis? How do you make a C.S. Lewis?
Right.
Like what kinds of encounters and experiences and nature and nurture, right, did we have? And so when I started delving into that and I saw, here's Flora Lewis, this budding mathematician who literally was going to the college when women were being outright mocked, right, in the 1880s. They were being outright mocked in class by male students for doing that. And here she is just garnering all these firsts and seconds in the midst of all that.
Crystal could tell a few of those stories from the 1980s. That didn't go away in the 19th century. Yeah.
Oh, it's unfortunate. But, she had so much courage. I didn't realize at the time until I started looking into the, some of the research on Queens as an institution, that there was so much outright antagonism toward women in the academy. And here was Flora going and, knocking out all these great things. And because of Flora's accomplishments, there were 2 or 3 names that were mentioned in this reference. The college actually considered allowing women to take more courses and gain degrees.
Because of Flora.
Because of Flora.
Wow.
And they tried it a couple different times and it failed, but it did finally pass. It was a few years later. But Flora's accomplishments were the catalysts for those conversations.
Wow.
She was also kind of a model of the mere Christian. She would hire Catholic workers to clean her house and do other things. And other people, one of them said, send those Catholics to the devil. They sent a note through her mail slot.
Wow.
But she had a very early sense, no, we're all Christians here. Let's try to get along. And in some ways, I think she was a very early model for Lewis. You can be a mere Christian. You don't have to choose a denomination and treat other Christians as if they're anathema.
Yeah, that's very unique in Ireland to have that
Yeah,
kind
especially
of
in Ireland.
attitude.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. They were, as a family, they were set apart in many ways from the conventional, families of their time. And Albert was saying in a letter I was looking at today, your mother was not a very demonstrative woman, but she knew what she believed. And when she died, she went into it calmly and gracefully. Right. So, you don't have to be shouting in the street. And Lewis even says in one of the letters, it's how we live and not what we say that makes the biggest impact on people.
Right. And she actually left some notes saying, I hope that my sons will grow up to be strong Christian men.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, I think as he looked through her papers, he had to remember this kind of saintly mother who really understood the foundational principles of Christianity. And I think that put him in good stead as he rounded up his own spiritual journey and said, yes, I can find a place for myself in the kingdom.
Did Flora ever publish anything? Like, do we have any math things that she wrote or?
No, we have one short story which is lost, and we have her letters, and she's very delightful in her letters. Yeah, we do have 2 pieces in the Lewis papers. We have The Miracle at Firenze, which was something she wrote when she was 12. She was in Rome, which honestly, Rome is the last place that Thomas Hamilton should have been. His anti-Catholic sentiment. And it's actually a piece that she wrote at 12 where, she's in a church, in a Catholic church, and they're saying that this statue had blinked or cried or something. And she was saying, is it a miracle or not? And she was very cynical about it, which to me just shows that she was hearing what her dad was saying.
Yeah,
sort of,
critical thinker.
Yeah, and I think as she grew up, she sort of mellowed out and was just like, you know what, there's no point in being so antagonistic towards people are people, and you just gotta love people. And so there's that, and there's also a piece where she did a mock sermon. Old Mother Hubbard, and she did it in a style of a fiery sermon.
Oh wow!
Like a hellfire sermon.
Yeah. So that, and there's actually a piece of that. It's not the whole thing. A piece of it's in volume 1 of the collected letters. You can read part of that. But yeah, I mean, she's sort of making fun of you know what that old dog did, you know, like,
that is funny. Once again, Lewis had this great satirical wit, so you can see the genetics there.
Oh, absolutely.
I think there's one page where it says E is equal to MC cubed. And you go, oh, that was so close. She was so close. It took another generation to refine that. No, I'm kidding, listeners. I'm kidding.
It's funny. Like Albert was wanting to do literature. He kind of did law because he was naturally good at it. And honestly, his dad was kind of running out of money to send him to school. And he was just going to like, well, I'll go ahead and apprentice with this lawyer's office. And so and then he was just so gifted at it. He was just so good at it. He was great at talking. I mean, so many of these newspaper articles were talking about just how incredibly persuasive he was.
Right.
I mean, they said he would just dismantle any opponent.
Wow.
Well, Lewis later on became famous for this Socratic club, how quick he was.
Yeah.
Somebody would give a great presentation, and he would get up and start some interaction, and before you knew it, he had turned the tables on the speaker. And that's very lawyerly skill to be so rhetorically quick like that. So
it makes you wonder if their father did stuff like that to them when they were in...
Oh, all the time.
All the disagreeing with their father.
Oh, yeah. There's parts where he said he kind of felt like he was, in the dock, which is their term for, being on trial.
Right.
They felt like that as his children. And he was very... they talk about his Victorian tendencies in a negative way, but he liked talking about these things in front of his children. I think he wanted to sort of expose them to, the goings on of Belfast and how things worked. But it really it kind of had the opposite impact on them. They just hated politics and they hated all that talk.
Those adult things.
Right.
Politics and money. Both brothers felt like that was such dry topics. When you're reading all this wonderful fantasy and myth and all that, you don't want to hear about politics and money.
Right. You mentioned that Albert gave quite a few political speeches. Did he run for office, or he just was supporting another person's political platform? He
was typically, James Corey was, I think in the 1885 election, he did several speeches in support of him, which was and I use this term conservative because that's what they say, but it doesn't mean conservative as what we in America in 2021 mean as conservative. Like, it's important to make those distinctions because, in Europe 150 years ago, it meant, something a little bit different. Right. But he did quite a bit. He spoke on home rule a lot. He actually never ran. I believe, based on what I've read, that he probably would have been interested in maybe going to serve in Parliament at some point. And then he kind of got disillusioned with everything and just the back and forth. And it's interesting because like some of his early speeches, people would give him feedback, right? And he would get kind of upset about it. And
none of the rest of us have that problem.
And I think over time he sort of realized, this comes with part and parcel with being a politician, all this stuff. But he joined the Belmont Literary Society in the early 80s, in the early 1880s, because he loved literature so much, and he really wanted. I mean, he sort of lived vicariously through C.S. Lewis's, literary pursuits. He was very, very proud of his son for doing all these wonderful things because Albert loved all these writers and poets too. Flora didn't really like poetry, but Albert did.
It's kind of fascinating to make you think about how his life could have turned out differently if Flora didn't pass away.
Well,
we often think about Lewis and the impact that her death had on him, but to think about how his life and the trajectory of his life might have turned out differently.
Yeah, he was a very stay-at-home type person. Even Lewis got wounded and said, I'm in Bristol, I'm in the hospital, I've got these shrapnel wounds, please come see me. And he just loved routine. And Lewis reports, I think it's in Surprised by Joy, they would go to the beach, this beautiful, North Shore of Ireland, and see Dunluce Castle. And his father would walk up and down the sand in a suit looking at his watch. So I think that's part of what killed his career. Is to be a politician, you have to travel and glad hand. And he was very much, he loved his routine. He was a great speaker. In the Lewis papers, there's a speech on anti-home rule. The Protestants of the North did not want to join the Catholics in the South and be one separate island, and they still aren't. They're still the north of Ireland and Ireland. But he said, we're kind of like Joseph. We've done all these wonderful things for Britain, and now at a time when we need Britain's help, nobody remembers Joseph. And so he had this it's very Lewisian in the sense of his son, to take a biblical situation and turn that into what was going on at their particular moment. So I think if he'd been willing to travel more, he was a great speaker, but he was very wedded to routine and did not want to break out of that. So I have a feeling it is interesting when Lewis wrote his first volume of poetry, a lot of which were very atheistic or skeptical, or God is not at all a positive figure. And Warren said, I don't think it's wise for this young man to be broadcasting his atheist opinions. Albert, the father, wrote back and said, well, there's some good poetry there. I think there are a few things that people will not willingly let die. So rather than being offended by the politics, he was so proud of his 20-year-old son for getting a book of poetry published.
Wow.
Yeah, so I agree. I think in some ways, I wish they'd lived longer. They had a really good reconciliation near the elder Lewis's death, but I wish he'd lived another 10 years, and they really could have. At the end of Pilgrim's Regress, when the pilgrim John comes back to where he started in Puritania, he says, my mother and father are gone. There's so much that I would have told them. And I'm sure that's Lewis's own feeling of, Mom, Dad, I'm a very enthusiastic Christian person. I'm an eloquent advocate. I've picked up the values that were most important to you. So there is a kind of pathos in the fact that he never got a chance to show them that he became the kind of man that they would have wanted him to become.
Yeah.
Wow.
And even in the letters, when like, for example, when Lewis wins a scholarship, one of the first things that Albert says is, I'm proud of you. Mammy would be so proud of you today.
Right.
And because always bringing that back of the sort of the corporate approval of the parents, even with one of them gone.
Right.
Flora had a sister named Lily Suffren. She was, and she actually did some work reading and helping revise Dahmer. Right.
Really?
Yeah. She was.
Could have used more help.
Yeah.
One of his better efforts.
I like Dahmer. I mean,
You and Jerry Root. Well, now we're up to two. We're up to two now.
I know. Jerry and I are sort of united. Just us two. Wonder Twin Powers activate.
Yeah,
I guess.
the Dahmer fan club. There's you and you.
I love Dahmer. Yeah, it's very pre-conversion Lewis. I mean, I've had people tell me I can't really read volume 1 of the letters. I don't know who that man is.
Right.
And I think to me, it's just a beautiful, magnificent example of the transformative power of Christ. And when you look, again, when you look at his family and how, like, even Albert keeps talking about, be strong, be courageous. He's telling him, be all these things that a good man is supposed to be. He even tells Warnie, if you don't, pass your exam, be a man of character and a man of industry. And I couldn't be prouder if you fail, which you passed, of course, if you win or lose, if you're a man of character and you're a man of industry, you will always make me proud.
Well, that is a wonderful note to end on, the transformative power of Christ, which you really see by studying Lewis's background and his early literature, like Dahmer, and then just see how his parents affected not only his sense of the power of fiction, but also, as you're studying right now, his ability to be a leader. Thank you for joining us, Crystal.
Thank you all for having me. It's been a pleasure.
The Wade Center podcast is a production of the Marion E. Wade Center at Wheaton College in Wheaton, Illinois. Our hosts are the co-directors of the Wade Center, Drs. Crystal and David C. Downing. Our episodes are produced and edited by Aaron M. Hill. If you enjoy the podcast and the content we offer, please leave us a review on iTunes, tell your friends, and consider making a donation to the Wade. The Wade Center is entirely self-funded. Financial gifts help support the expert services, vast collections, and varied programming we offer at no cost. If you have questions about the podcast or suggestions for future episodes, please email us at wade@wheaton.edu or contact us via Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube. To learn more about the Wade Center, our 7 British Christian authors, what we offer, and how to make a donation, visit our website at wheaton.edu/Wade.